Chapter 37, Rewarding Loyalty. "You're late," Isabela crossed her arms as she pushed herself out of her chair. Faren and I boarded the ship only a few minutes earlier. One of the crew had let us on, grumbling about how bored he'd been. We took a few minutes to put our things in our cabin before going to Isabela's quarters. Isabela had apparently instructed the crew to send us directly to her when we arrived. When we entered her quarters, she seemed rather annoyed. Understandable, since we estimated we would have been back a week or two before. "Apologies," I said as I bowed my head. "We ran into some unexpected difficulties that held us up." "Difficulties?" Isabela asked. "Those must have been some extreme difficulties." Faren pulled a chair out for me and held it for me while I took a seat. "Monumental difficulties. We had a run-in with some Kalsharok dwarves that ended up creating a whole set of issues we had to deal with." "Family squabble?" Isabela pried. "I forget. Are you lot related or not? I suppose not, considering how far away you are from each other." I thanked Faren for the chair, then shook my head. No relation beyond some very distant, centuries-old blood ties that would be hard to prove even if they still existed. It was more of a series of... I paused to think about how best to phrase how things had gone. Territorial and policy disputes. They didn't appreciate what I had to do and disagreed on the level of authority which I claimed to have. We sorted things out in due time, though. 2 weeks? Isabela scoffed. "Is that what you call due time?" Admittedly, dwarven politics are slow and meticulous, but they get solid results in the end, I smiled. "I trust you delivered the letter?" Isabela nodded. "I did." They seemed rather confused, but thanked me all the same. They also assured me that they will bring it to the princess's attention immediately. My smile widened. "Excellent. I have no doubt that she will be as grateful for your patience as we are." "I bloody well hope so," Isabela groaned. "Do you know how much grumbling I've had to hear from this lot because of all this downtime? They don't do well sitting in one place." Faren chuckled and smirked at me. "I suppose the princess will just have to see about compensating them somehow." I shot Faren a smirk. "And I think someone else will have to take a more active role in another reenactment." "You wouldn't dare," Faren snarled playfully. "Oh, I dare," I grinned. Isabela laughed, knowing exactly what to expect after having seen our display the first time. "So we're ready to set sail then?" "Aye, Captain," I smiled with excitement. We left port soon after. The crew's mood was much better once we were in open water. Sailors don't exactly do well just lazing about in port, but I was grateful they had waited for us. I had to think of what I could do to thank them later. Maybe I'd have some barrels of dwarven stout sent with them after we disembarked. 1 for each man. I was certain the men would love that, and Isabela would have mixed feelings after she sobered up. Faren ended up performing the Titanic reenactment with me, and this time he was Leo. The trip went smoothly. No bad weather. No pirates. I was slightly disappointed at the lack of pirates, but I suppose I was on a boat that had its own notorious reputation, so that would explain that. Still, it would have been fun to engage in a little naval combat. Faren was happy that nothing happened, but I bemoaned the fact that our only chance to fight some pirates had come and gone. The trip back to Amaranthine only took about a week, with some poor wind causing the crossing to take more time than it normally would have. When Amaranthine was on the horizon, Faren and I began to pack up our things. I met with Isabela and insisted that we dock as late as possible. When she asked the reason for the request, I simply said that we wanted to enjoy as much time on the water as possible. The truth, of course, being that I didn't want to take the chance of being spotted by anyone that would recognize me. So we waited a few hours for the sun to begin setting, and as the ship began to dock, Faren and I donned cloaks and our things. "I don't see anyone here to welcome us with a reward," Isabela sniped. I smiled up at her. "I'd wager they're holding it in the deep roads until I arrive. I'll return first thing tomorrow morning with whatever the princess has sent." Isabela arched a brow. I'm not exactly a fan of delayed payment, especially after such a delay. Faren patted Isabela's shoulder. Don't worry, Captain. The princess never fails to disappoint when repaying a debt. I'd wager you'll get what was promised, and more. Isabela sighed and nodded. I'm not one to doubt someone with her reputation, but this is business we're talking about. If you two don't come back tomorrow morning, what recourse do I have? No matter what happens, I said with a bright smile, I promise you will return with what was promised, one way or another. Isabela nodded in resignation. All right, but I'd better see the two of you before noon. I laughed and smiled mischievously. Oh, you will. Faren and I disembarked the ship sometime later once it had gotten dark enough. We headed straight back to the Deep Road's entrance and slipped through the milling dwarves until we arrived at the estate where my personal guard had been staying since I'd left. They welcomed us home and a few of my servants helped us with our things. Once I had bathed and taken my meal, I met with the guards to discuss what, if anything, had happened that I needed to be made aware of. Apart from the assembly announcing my upcoming coronation, not much had really occurred. I asked about any darkspawn issue and was surprised when I was told that no darkspawn had been seen in all the time we'd been gone. That evening was one of the loneliest I'd experienced since I'd been reborn into Thedas. I had spent every day and night with Faren for the past few months, and when I finally went to bed, I felt like a part of me was missing. I laid in bed, staring up at the ceiling and wondering how much longer I would have to wait before we could be married. I respected and understood the need for us to stay separate until our wedding, but that didn't mean I was happy being without him. I would need to speak to Father and the assembly about moving that particular timeline up. The next morning, Faren and I dressed properly once more. I was dressed in a brilliant garnet and gold gown with plate, armor, accents, jewelry, and thin, mithril chains with jeweled charms woven into my braids. Faren wore his plate armor, polished and pristine as always. My personal guard went ahead of us to the surface to announce our arrival. They led us through the streets of people who quickly gathered to watch us pass. I smiled and waved at onlookers who cheered and waved back. We made our way to the docks slowly but surely. One of the guards ran ahead as Isabela and the crew moved to the railing to watch our arrival. Announcing the arrival of Princess Merida and Orodum, she requests permission to come aboard. Request permission? Isabela asked and looked at her crew. Granted, I suppose. The guards led Faren and I up the gangplank and kept us surrounded until separating and revealing us to the crew. The look on their faces was priceless. Most of them seemed confused, while the others thought it was hilarious. Isabela's eyes went wide as she gawked at us. You? You're Princess Orodum? I bowed my head. And a good day to you, Captain. I'm here to thank you for your help and for your patience. First, I believe there was a matter of your payment. Faren motioned for some of the guards to come forward. A pair of dwarves stepped forward with a large chest and set it in front of Isabela. One of them opened the chest up to reveal that it was filled with gold coins and assorted jewels. The entire crew gasped and stared at the contents. I trust that will suffice as far as our agreement goes, I smiled up at Isabela. Too right it does, Isabela shouted as she stared at the chest. One of the guards cleared his throat. You are addressing the princess. Show some respect. Oh, Isabela gasped. Right! She waved at the crew to get them to act properly. She led them in a very uncoordinated bow. Yes, princess, you are quite generous. I bit the inside of my lips to try and not grin, but the change of the crew's demeanor was too funny. A smirk escaped me, and I burst out a loud laugh. I clutched my stomach and continued to laugh as I looked up at them all. I apologize, but it's so funny to see how you're all acting now. It's fine if you're not so stiff and formal. The crew all seemed to visibly relax. Isabela smiled and crossed her arms. Well, princess, you sure pulled the wool over our eyes. I chuckled and regained my composure. I'm quite sure I have no idea what you're talking about. Faren wasn't lying when he said he'd been in my service since he was a child. In fact, he's been in my service since I was a year old, and I was doing work on my behalf. Isabela nodded and smirked. Yet you failed to mention that you were the princess. I shrugged puckishly. You seemed happy enough to do the princess a favor. Why complicate things and make you second-guess yourself, or act differently around me? Also, I couldn't afford to let the assembly know I was out in the world without my bodyguards. So, I'd appreciate it if you all kept that little tidbit to yourselves, at least until my coronation. Isabela grinned. Oh, I don't know about that, princess. A story like that? That'd be a lot to keep under wraps. I laughed and smiled. I thought you might say that, which is why I also got you this. Another guard stepped out of the formation with a large, wide box. He opened the box and revealed a large, wide-brimmed hat with a long, plumed feather. Wow, it's a hat, Isabela said hesitantly. She looked at me as if she was confused. Thank you. I turned and walked to the port side of the ship and motioned for Isabela to follow me. I just assumed an admiral should have a big hat. Isn't that the tradition? Isabela looked confusedly at me. That is the tradition. However, I should point out that I'm a captain, not an admiral. I hummed and smiled up at Isabela. I think we can rectify that. If you'd agree to dedicate one of your ships to make a monthly run from Amaranthine to Kirkwall and Valroyo, so that the surface-cast dwarves can have a reliable northern port to ship through. I think we can change that. How do you propose to change that? Isabela asked. I grinned up at her, then looked out over the other ships docked around us. At this point, Isabela began to notice that the crew of several ships were standing on their respective decks. I took a deep breath and shouted, "Eni! Sailors, salute your admiral!" 11 ships full of sailors snapped to attention and saluted in unison. Isabela was awestruck as she turned and looked at me. What? What is this? I grinned up at her. This is your fleet. So long as you agree to my terms, you can take whatever jobs you like. Isabela looked down at me in surprise. You must be joking. I shook my head. You're a fine captain, Isabela. You make some questionable decisions at times, but I think when you have a fleet of ships to concern yourself over, as well as a dedicated customer base, you'll think things over more carefully. You're really willing to take that sort of risk? Isabela chuckled. Most of my greatest accomplishments have come with some of my most dangerous risks, I replied with a nod. But you've proven to be a reliable captain, so I want you to be a reliable admiral. Would you be willing to look at the contract? Isabela smirked and placed the hat elegantly on her head. Let's see it. We took the next hour to go over the contract I had instructed my people to draw up. In it, Isabela would be required to dedicate a ship each month to transporting surface-cast goods from Amaranthine to Kirkwall and Valroyo, and return with goods that would be sent from representatives from those ports. She would be restricted from smuggling any kind of illegalities, including slaves. She also would be restricted from engaging in piracy, raiding, or reaving of any kind. Beyond those conditions, she was free to operate the fleet in any way she saw fit. However, while the fleet was under her command, it was under the umbrella of Rika's business. And since Rika's new family was under House Orodum, it meant that the fleet was mine. I would get a cut of the fleet's revenue, and it was my purse that paid the sailors and maintained the ships. Essentially, Isabela agreed to be the admiral of the fledgling fleet of the growing Dwarven Empire. By the end of the day, we'd ironed all the details out, and I was happy to leave with a contract that I could bring home to offer the assembly. I would start with a small flea to move our goods. Over time, the ships would be moved to Gwaran and manned by dwarves. We'd become a reliable naval power to help with Ferelden's defense. This would make us even more indispensable to Ferelden, and thus give us even more bargaining power in diplomatic situations. With dwarves in charge of the roads, the water, and the majority of trade, the dwarves would essentially control Ferelden through every measurable aspect beyond religion and legal noble authority. However, with the announcement of my arrival in Amaranthine, I was obligated to pay Serena and Alistair a visit. We stayed there for a week, catching up with our friends and discussing a few matters of importance concerning the expansion of Amaranthine's docks, some minor trade issues, and surface cast taxes with regards to imported goods. The visit was short, however, as Alistair and Serena were preparing to move to Denerim, so they could be prepared to take over for King Merrick. They were also preparing to allow Honora to arrive and become an interim governor of the Arling until one of their children could take over. It was a raw deal for Honora, and I doubted she would remain content with it. I wondered how Serena would deal with that particular issue. We left for home after that week. It was a sad journey for me, because I didn't know when I would ever get to leave Orzammar again. Still, while I wasn't exactly looking forward to that eventuality, I was pleased to be returning with the loyalty of Kal Shirok and a contract that gave the dwarves a small fleet of ships. The fledgling dwarven empire was bigger and had a longer reach than when I had left. Two of Theda's greatest threats had been dealt with forever, and I had essentially doubled my eventual power. All in all, the trip, while a fleeting few months of freedom, was worth it in the end, even if it meant I wouldn't be free for the rest of my life.